number 10, Phung Lim. Back during World War II, nowhere was safe. Allied forces were risking their lives wherever they went because those they were fighting seemed to have been one step ahead every time. One of the most dangerous places for Allies was in open water because fleets were crossing the ocean trying to bring supplies back and forth from the front lines, and German forces were waiting to strike from above and below water. In 1942, a British ship was crossing the Atlantic Ocean, coming from South Africa on its way to deliver supplies, but once the ship reached the coast of South America, it was torpedoed and it sank. The only person to survive was a member of the ship's crew named Phung Lim, and he managed to jump ship just before it sank. Because of the conditions, Phung Lim might not have survived had his luck not come through. You see, after jumping ship, he managed to find one of the ship's rafts and some canisters of water and food floating in the water. With this, he was able to survive drifting off the coast of South America for 133 days before he was found and rescued by a Brazilian fisherman. Other than having a severe sunburn and some stomach issues from eating raw fish that he was able to catch, Phung was in good health when he was found. This man survived all odds and went on to live in the US until 1991.
Number 9. Matt Suter. Are you a big fan of the film Twister? Well, today we have a story that might just be better than the movie. What? Matt Suter literally rode a tornado and lived to tell the tale. Yeah. In 2006, Matt was at his grandmother's trailer, standing on the couch trying to seal the window because there was a storm outside. The weather was really bad, but he didn't know how bad until the floor started moving and everything started like swirling around him. The doors were being torn off. Matt was in the middle of being swept up in a tornado. The next moment, he was sucked out of a collapsing wall into a whirling, swirling darkness. Also, forget Ruby slippers, the guy was only in his underpants. He really shouldn't have survived this. Like, he really shouldn't have, especially with all the debris flying around. But flash forward to Suter regaining consciousness about 3 football fields away, 390 meters from the trailer, making him, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, the farthest distance survived in a tornado. What's even crazier is all he had were like a few scrapes and bruises. Yeah.
In at number 8, Louis Zamperini. This next individual not only survived one life-altering event, but 2, and it's pretty incredible. Back in 1943, during World War II, Louis Zamperini and his crewmates were flying their plane during a rescue mission over the Pacific when something malfunctioned and they crashed. They survived the initial crash and found refuge on a raft, but after 33 days, one of their crewmates passed away, leaving Louis and one other member. Those 2 were able to survive on that raft for 47 days, living off fish and rainwater, and soon they were found by Japanese forces, but that's when things got even worse for them. They were captured and tortured by a camp sergeant who was referred to as the Bird. While imprisoned, Louis endured so much. At one point, the Bird ordered the other prisoners to take turns punching Louis in the face for 2 straight hours. Another time, Louis was forced to hold a large heavy beam over his head for nearly 40 minutes before being forcibly knocked to the ground. But even after all of that, Louis ended up surviving the war and was liberated in 1945. He even went out of his way to meet with the Bird one last time years later to tell him that he forgave him for everything that he was put through. Talk about a survival story.
Coming in at number 7, we have Joan Murray. On September 25th, 1999, Joan Murray, a 47-year-old bank executive and skydiver, drove to Chester, South Carolina for one of the scariest skydives of her career. Once the plane reached 14,500 feet above the ground, Joan jumped out of the plane only to discover that her parachute was not working. So what did she do? She cut off the defective chute and prepared to deploy the reserve chute. Her reserve chute opened, but it wasn't until she was 700 feet above the ground. For those that don't know skydiving that well, that's a really close call. Joan hit the earth at 80 miles per hour and landed on top of a pit of fire ants. The ants bit her 200 times before she was finally retrieved by paramedics. It was thanks to these bites though that she was able to survive the shock of the fall, as the reaction to these bites kept her heart beating. She was then rushed to hospital and was in a coma for 2 weeks. She then underwent 20 reconstructive surgeries, 17 blood transfusions, and after 6 weeks in hospital, she was finally able to stand once again. This is one crazy call with death, but Joan made it through. Once again, another one I can't even fathom, and now I will officially never skydive no matter what and no matter how curious I get. This one is crazy.
Number 6, Mauro Prosperi. real life is stranger than fiction. Adrenaline junkies will do anything for that rush they get when the stakes are really high, and Mauro Prosperi was no exception. Italian Mauro Prosperi loved to push himself, so he decided to take on the Marathon of Sands in the Sahara Desert, a 6-day marathon across the desert covering 156 miles. Usually there are thousands of people who join for the strength in numbers mentality, but in the year Mauro did it, which was 1994, there were just 134 competitors. A father of 3 and 39 years old, Mauro did everything he could to prepare, but nothing prepared him for the massive sandstorm on the 4th day. Mauro kept running, and when it passed, he completely lost his way. From a challenging marathon to a quest for survival, Mauro did everything he could to endure. He licked the dew off of rocks, drank his own urine, and indulged in rats, lizards, and bird eggs he discovered in an abandoned temple. Still, with no rescue in sight and days of searching, Mauro became so disheartened he tried to take his own life. But his blood was too dehydrated, it just coagulated too soon, so he was forced to continue. Eventually he discovered a puddle with enough water to revive him, but he had to take small sips because otherwise it would just all come up. Finally, he was found wandering by a shepherd girl. He lost 35 pounds, weighing in at 99 pounds when they found him, and his liver had almost entirely failed. His survival story has been described as nothing short as superhuman. What's crazy, this is crazy, he went back and he completed it in 2012. This time he stayed on the path and there was no sandstorms, but he actually went back after that.
Coming in at our halfway point at number 5, we have Juliane Koepcke. Juliane went through something that I know Dewey Stewart would never have survived. Juliane was supposed to graduate on December 23rd, 1971, but her mother wanted to fly out on the 19th or 20th. But Juliane disagreed with that and wanted to stay for her graduation. So her mom booked a flight on Christmas Eve instead. Quite horrifically and tragically, while on the flight, the plane was struck by lightning, which nearly fully disintegrated the craft 2 miles above the ground. Juliane stayed strapped into her seat as the plane quickly approached the earth, and she braced for impact. Miraculously enough, she survived with only a broken collarbone and a couple of cuts on her arms and legs. She then survived off a bag of sweets that she found at the crash site and traveled along a nearby stream until she came to a cabin. After surviving 11 days in the jungle, she was rescued by local fishermen and rushed to hospital. Once she was reunited with her father and fully healed, she returned to the crash site to help rescue and recover what they could. She heartbreakingly found her deceased mother who had passed in the crash. I can't even fathom going through something like this, but Juliane did. Juliane, I'm very, very sorry for your loss, but major kudos to you for surviving and helping out the rescue and recovery. That's major respect.
By the way, if you want a part 2 because there's actually a lot of really cool stories, let us know in the comments. Make sure to like, subscribe, do your thing. Anyways, number 4, Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart. After I'm finished this tale, you'll understand why he was dubbed the unkillable soldier. The only thing that eventually took him was the thing that takes us all: time. De Wiart served in the Boer War and both World Wars. Throughout all 3, he was, okay, ready? Shot in the face, lost his left eye and hand, shot through the skull, hip, leg, and ear, and he survived. This guy was literally a boss. He was seen pulling pins out of grenades and throwing them with his one good arm during the Battle of the Somme, which, if you don't know, was one of the absolute worst battles between both world wars. Despite the haughty depictions of generals in, say, like Blackadder, he was always on the battlefield serving as a general beside his men, a hero to the highest order. In April 1941, while on a military mission in Yugoslavia, in his 60s, no less, his plane was shot down in the Mediterranean. He survived the crash, swam to shore again, freaking one arm, and then captured by Italian soldiers and put into a POW camp. He then tried to escape and even successfully eluded capture for 8 days, but he didn't look Italian, so it was pretty easy to spot. He was released 2 years later, and Churchill then sent him to be his representative in China. Eventually the man retired from life on the battlefield and lived out the rest of his days in County Cork, fishing until passing peacefully at the age of 83. Because none of the rest of it killed him. Number 3, Mary Vincent. This one gets pretty dark, so please trigger warning for anyone who wants to avoid severe tales of violent attacks and assaults. Just leaving that out there. I couldn't leave this story off the list, it's so incredible. Mary Vincent survived the impossible and continues to help survivors to this day. In September 1978, Mary Vincent was hitchhiking to Berkeley, California when 50-year-old Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He looked harmless, but little did Mary know he would change her life forever. He viciously attacked Mary, cut off both her arms, and threw her off a cliff. He thought she was dead, but Mary, oh no one messes with Mary. This girl is the real Kill Bill. This woman, armless, stripped, and in excruciating pain, climbed back up the cliff, was rescued by a couple on their honeymoon, and proceeded to toss her assailant behind bars. The one thought that kept her going was that she didn't want this to happen to anyone else. That literally got her out of her stupor and she climbed back up. Unfortunately, Lawrence was released just after 8 years into his sentence. Eye roll. But then he took another life, and after that got the death penalty. Lawrence died in 2001 from cancer, and Mary, well, she's an artist, has 2 amazing kids, and continues to speak out against violence. Mary Vincent, you are a damn hero.
At number 2, Old Christians Club. This next story of survival against odds was so unbelievable that it just had to be turned into a movie. In October of 1972, a Uruguayan plane en route from Chile carrying a rugby team and their families crash-landed in the Andes Mountains. Of the 45 passengers on board, 25 of them survived, but just 2 weeks later, 8 more lost their lives when an avalanche hit the crash site. Because of the avalanche, the other survivors, who were trapped in the snow at an altitude of more than 13,000 feet, got desperate to survive, and they had to resort to something pretty grisly. Hold on to your coats, guys, because this one's gonna get a little dark. The Old Christian Club survivors eventually resorted to eating the flesh of their dead friends and family who were preserved by the snow and cold. 2 months after the crash, 2 of the remaining survivors got desperate and decided to wander off from the crash site and hiked off into the wilderness in search of any help. Miraculously, after 10 days of walking, they found a livestock herder, and by the following day, they were able to get rescue crews and helicopters out to the crash site to save the remaining survivors. It is a miracle that they were able to survive so long.
And last but not least, Aaron Ralston. Don't worry, this list will not be 127 hours long by the time we are finished, but we are definitely going to talk about Aaron Ralston. If you have seen the film, then you may know the remarkable story of this rock climber. In April 2003, Aaron was taking on Utah's Blue John Canyon by himself when tragedy struck. While climbing, an 800-pound boulder fell onto Aaron, trapping and crushing his right hand. Entirely alone, Aaron had to do everything he could to survive. After chipping away at the boulder proved unsuccessful, and a pulley rig with his climbing rope was useless, there was only one thing left. Ralston had to do the unthinkable and self-amputate his own arm. He devised a turnkey, and even though he had no feeling in his hand, Aaron had to painstakingly cut through each nerve and break his own bone, which he describes was 100 times worse than any pain I've felt before, unquote. No kidding. He then rappelled down the 60-foot cliff where a family hiking found him and called emergency services. Now equipped with a prosthetic, Aaron has remarkably begun climbing again, because obviously nothing is impossible when it comes to Ralston.
Starting our list off at number 10, Juliane Koepcke. Miss Juliane, okay, she is a 2-for-1 when it comes to survival stories. I'm starting our list off hot here. Her story starts out on Christmas Eve back in 1971. When she was quite young, she was on Lanza Flight 508. Now the plane was struck by lightning, which is an actual nightmare, and I didn't think that could even happen, to be honest with you, so now I'm terrified. But the plane started to disintegrate midair, worst case scenario. She was still strapped to her seat 2 miles above the Peruvian rainforest, yet somehow she landed and survived. She was injured, of course, full of bruises, a broken collarbone, yada yada, just the horrible worst case scenario, but she was alive, and in fact she was the only person who had been on the flight that was still alive. How incredible is that? But now, she was in the wilderness, right? And all she had with her was just a bit of candy for food that she got from the flight. Juliane found a small stream which she began to wade in, go follow it downstream to see and hope that it ends somewhere with some people, but the insects in the jungle were eating her alive, and this next part's a little bit gross here, but maggots had infected her arm, right? It's almost getting worse as we go on. Juliane ended up coming across a sort of encampment where she found a few supplies, and she was pretty smart here. She was able to give herself a little bit of first aid, which included pouring gasoline on said infected arm, which then led to all the disgusting creatures living in it. They all came pouring out. And then just a few hours later, a few lumber workers thankfully found her and gave her first aid treatment, better treatment than the gasoline, and then took her to an area that was more populated. In 2000, her story was told through the documentary titled Wings of Hope, which was directed by by Werner Herzog, who took particular interest in this story because, one, it's obviously incredible, but two, he had a seat booked on that flight and he would have been on it if it wasn't for a last-minute change of plans.
Number 9. No Man's Land. Richard Norris Williams II was an American tennis player and one of the most infamous RMS Titanic survivors. Williams was born in Geneva, Switzerland, and started playing tennis around the age of 12. Naturally gifted at this, his passion became his career, and by 1911, Williams had won the Swiss championship. A year later, he joined Harvard's team. Yeah, this guy was good. This guy played for Harvard. He and his father Charles were traveling first class on the ocean liner when, of course, as we all know, struck an iceberg and sank. This guy was badass though. Ready? During the chaos of the first hour, he managed to free a man trapped underwater by kicking in a door. Yeah, right out of the movie. After losing his father right in front of his own eyes, he dove in and held onto the side of a lifeboat, accepting his fate. After climbing in, he spent several hours knee-deep in the freezing water, which left his legs so severely frostbitten that the rescue ship's doctor wanted to amputate them immediately. Williams, stating that he was an athlete, decided to just get up and walk it off. Got up and started lapping the ship until the circulation just came back to him. Later that year, he went on to win his first US tennis championship, then went on to continue crushing Olympics since, and even earning him a spot in the Hall of Fame.
Number 8. 2 missed flights. Back in 2014, there were 2 plane crashes. These tragic crashes were of course all over the media. You probably remember them. I remember vividly hearing about them. And I also remember hearing about Martin de Jong. I'll get into that in just a second. But in 2012, the first plane was sadly shot down over Ukraine, and the second plane landed somewhere in the Indian Ocean. And to this day, it's still talked about. It's quite a mystery what exactly happened. But lives were lost. These questions will never stop coming in. One detail that we do know that connects both crashes, other than the fact that both incidents involved the same airline company, one wild detail here is a man named Martin de Jong. The Dutch cyclist was scheduled to take both of these flights. Now in both scenarios, Martin bumped his ticket when cheaper options were available. So he cheated death twice initially. This is unbelievable. Also still, we have no idea what happened to the plane. Like, that's still in the air. We're still talking about that.
Number 7. Dr. Anna Bagenholm. In May 2000, on her usual ski trail in Narvik, Norway, Dr. Anna, at age 29, was ready for a break, but there were some unexpected turns in her trip that would make her world renowned. She lost her balance suddenly on a gully, which launched her headfirst into an icy river. She was stuck submerged under the ice, but Anna managed to reach an air pocket that might have saved her life. Her torso and head were stuck for 40 minutes while she struggled to break through. Anna was no doubt exhausted and her body was sinking slowly into a deathly state of hypothermia. Still, she maintained her determination, but it would be another 40 minutes before her companions found her and cut her out of the ice, dragged her out, but by then her body temp had significantly dropped to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. She should have died minutes later, but somehow she held on. Doctors were able to revive her by slowly warming her blood. In 2013, Bagenholm began working in the very same hospital that saved her life, and her case led to investigations into therapeutic hypothermia. Strangely enough, it may have been the cold that helped save her.
At number 6, Slavomir Rovics. You know that song 500 Miles? You know, the one where the guy is singing about how he would walk 500 miles and would walk 500 more and all that jazz? Well, imagine if it wasn't 500, but 4,000. Would you still walk that far? Well, if you're in a life or death situation like Slavomir Rovics, then you might. Slavomir was a Polish cavalry officer in World War II who was captured by German forces, sent to Moscow in 1939, and was later sentenced to 25 years of hard labor in Siberia. Bad start. Siberia is known for its harsh winter climate, so this sentence was going to be very harsh, and Slavomir wanted none of that. By 1941, during a blizzard, Slavomir and 6 other inmates managed to hatch a plan and escape from the prison that they were being held in. Desperate to get as far away from the enemy as possible, the prisoners walked 4,000 miles, crossing the Gobi Desert and the Himalayas, enduring blazing heat, intense cold, thirst, starvation, and exhaustion. They were eventually able to reach safety in India, where they were rescued by Gurkha Patrol, and by this point Slavomir only weighed 70 pounds. Later on in life though, he wrote a book about his miraculous survival.
Number 5. Helen Claiborne. Helen Claiborne took a nosedive out of her comfort zone when she decided to see what life was like outside of New York City. What she didn't know was that she would encounter a challenge far larger than what she bargained for. After her stint in Fairbanks concluded, she hopped on a plane with pilot Ralph Flores. Due to a heavy storm and lack of tech control, their plane crashed in the Alaskan wilderness at minus 40 degrees Celsius below. No thank you. Both were severely injured. Helen broke her arm and crushed her foot. Flores had lacerations and a broken jaw. Despite all odds, the pair survived on toothpaste, tree bark, snowshoes, and whatever else they could find over 49 days. Their meager rations ending 15 days in. Claiborne got frostbite and gangrene in her broken foot, and it wasn't until the two carved SOS into the snow that they were finally rescued. For a woman who had never left Brooklyn to survive without emergency gear or rations with a gangrenous foot, this story is like...
At number 4, Janelle Guzman McMillan. The attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001 changed the lives of so many, and it was a moment where the world seemed to have stood still. There are so many stories from those who were affected by the events of the attack, one of those stories being that of Janelle Guzman McMillan, a woman who survived the attack against all odds. Janelle sat down for an interview to tell her story about how she miraculously survived the attack and told the source about how she was working in one of the towers when the attack took place. She said that at first there was no sign of smoke or fire, and her boss told the company to just remain calm and wait for help, but instead Janelle headed for the stairway. She started heading down the stairs, but by the time she got to the 13th floor, she went to go take off her shoe, and suddenly a wall fell on her, pinning her feet and trapping her head between 2 blocks of concrete. The only thing that Janelle was able to move was her left hand, and when she tried opening her eyes, everything was black. She laid in the rubble for 27 hours before being rescued after she was spotted by one of the many search and rescue dogs that were brought to the site. Janelle ended up being the last living person to be rescued from the wreckage.
Number 3. Free falling. Vesna Vulovic was a Serbian flight attendant who, through no fault or training of her own, holds the Guinness World Record for surviving the highest fall without a parachute. Not on purpose, of course. Over 10,000 meters. Yeah, she was the sole survivor after a briefcase bomb exploded in the baggage compartment of a JAT Flight 367 January 1972, causing it to crash near Czechoslovakia. Vulovic spent days in a coma and was hospitalized for months. She suffered a fractured skull, 3 broken vertebrae, both broken legs, broken ribs, and a fractured pelvis, resulting in her temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. Vulovic made an almost complete recovery, walking only with a small limp. Dude, I got hit in rugby years ago, I still can't crack it right, you know what I mean? How did she get by?
Number 2, Hodges Meteorite. These happen pretty often, but luckily, most of the time it doesn't, wipe out everybody and everything, including the dinosaurs. Thanks for taking one for the team. Back in the day, dinos. We love it. Back in 1954, residents in Talladega County, Alabama, noticed a ball of fire heading towards them. Remember, this is the 50s. We didn't have Twitter. We couldn't warn people that a meteor was possibly going to take us all out. We had no idea. We just kind of watched. So we're like, well, We also didn't really know how to tell if meteorites were coming, so it was alarming. A lot of factors. Especially for Anne Elizabeth Hodges, who got hit by that said space rock. Yeah, that ball of fire hit her. You may be asking, oh, is she outside stargazing, doing a little cosmic ritual outside at midnight? No, she was napping in her living room, and an 8-pound chunk of meteorite smashed through her roof and grazed her hip. Yeah, she got grazed by a meteor from space and only received a bruise. That's it. First human to ever get hit by a meteorite. Period. What a flex that is. Imagine putting that on Tinder. Also, we're glad you're okay. This is blowing my mind. I thought orange hockey balls hurt growing up, getting one of those bruises. A space rock? A cosmic wrist shot straight through your living room? Hard pass. Hard pass.
And coming in at the number 1 spot, Wonder Woman. It's December 1994 in South Africa. 27-year-old Alison Botha was just parking from a night out when a man with a large knife opened her front door, pushed her over, and told her to drive. This mysterious man forced her to go pick up another man before driving off into the night. These 2 garbage human beings, who do not deserve to be named, took Alison to a deserted area off-road before performing the most violent and disgusting things to her, which I will not repeat. Before leaving her alone, of course, stranded for dead. In what was almost her last moments, Alison, barely breathing, despite being disemboweled disemboweled and nearly decapitated, crawled from her car to a busy road with the last mite that she could muster. With the belief that her life was too valuable to let die, she saw headlights in the distance and she knew that this was her chance. With one hand holding her stomach in and one hand holding her head on, Allison got herself to the middle of the road where she was picked up by a young veterinarian student named Tian Eliard. He used his medical knowledge to keep her alive until emergency services arrived. The doctors were shocked at the state that Allison was in. At the blood loss, the doctors were scratching their heads at her strength. Not only did Allison survive, but she also remembered every detail about her two attackers, which led police right to them. The two are now spending the rest of their lives in prison while Allison uses her voice and her experience to empower and motivate others all around the world. She's a fucking hero, dude. There should be like 60 movies about her, at least.
Starting off strong with number 10, Vesna Vulovic. Vesna Vulovic holds the title in the Guinness Book of World Records as the highest fall survived without a parachute. Before her name was even known worldwide, this Serbian woman was a simple flight stewardess. The 22-year-old became a flight attendant after she discovered a love for travel when she went to England. She joined Yugoslavia's largest airline in 1971, but 8 months later her life would change forever. After just 46 minutes, flight 367 flying from Copenhagen Airport, the baggage compartment exploded. The plane split in half mid-air and began tumbling from a height 333,330 feet. By some miracle, Vesna was the only survivor of the 28 people who were on the craft. Bruno Honk, a World War II medic, luckily, who was nearby, was the one that found her and kept her alive long enough for help to arrive. It was her screams that brought him to the craft. Vesna sustained 2 broken legs, 3 broken vertebrae, a fractured pelvis, broken ribs, and a fractured skull. After over a week in a coma and 10 months in hospital, Vesna was able to walk again, with no memory, however, of what happened because of the crash. Investigators discovered that Vesna had been pinned to the falling debris by a food cart, which may be the reason she survived. The most crazy thing is, Vesna continued to travel after the ordeal. What a boss!
Coming in at number 9, we have Yaha Abdi. Yaha Abdi, who is originally from Santa Clara, California, ran away from home on April 20th, 2014. Abdi left home with quite the ambitious mission. Sadly, his mother was in a refugee camp in Ethiopia and he was hoping to save her. Abdi made his way to the Mineta San Jose International Airport. Once there, he climbed the airport fence and after lingering for 6 hours, he snuck into a Boeing 767 through the landing gear and was hidden on board. The plane then reached altitudes of 38,000 feet and temperatures dropped to negative 80 degrees Fahrenheit. But miraculously, Abdi was able to survive the crazy flight. How? The sub-zero temperatures and low oxygen levels at such crazy altitudes pushed his body into a state of suspended animation, which let him survive the 5-hour trip. But once they arrived at the Hawaii airport, Abdi was found and was looked after by medics and he was crazily unharmed. That being said, he wasn't able to save his mama. So good on you for trying, buddy, but I do hope one day you get to see her again.
Number 8. Douglas Mawson. Antarctic geologist Douglas Mawson had one of the most terrible experiences while on a polar expedition. One of the worst in history. He, alongside colleague and friend Xavier Mertz and Lieutenant Belgrave Ninnis, attempted an expedition of the South Pole in 1912. They took 3 sleds pulled by 16 huskies that carried 1,720 pounds of food, survival gear, and scientific instruments. 300 miles in, they were making good time, but then strange things started happening. Mawson dreamed of his father, who he later discovered died that day, and they found one of the huskies devouring a litter of puppies that they had. Not unusual for that climate, but still pretty ominous. Then a series of disasters struck. Ninnis, along with his sled, fell to his death into a massive crevice, along with most of their food and survival equipment. After several days traveling and slowly cooking their own dogs, Mertz fell into a delirium and died on January 8th, leaving Mawson alone on the tundra. Meanwhile, Mawson was left alone and he also fell snowblind. As Mawson continued, his feet became walking blisters and he nearly succumbed to several cracks in the ice and practically had to drag himself for miles to get to the base camp. Finally, he made it to base camp on February 8th with barely a semblance of the man he once was. His fight for survival remains one of the greatest examples of human resilience to this day.
Number 7. Armbar. Every time I use a butter knife, I think about this one. Could I do it, you know? Aaron is an American mountaineer, mechanical engineer, and motivational speaker. His infamous mountaineering accident was an amazing near-death experience story leading to his autobiography, Between a Rock and a Hard Place. Amazing title, Aaron. And of course the 2010 film, 127 Hours. In 2002, he moved to Aspen to pursue a life of climbing mountains, starting his goal of climbing all of Colorado's 14ers, mountains with 14,000 feet of altitude or higher. In 2003, while Aaron was climbing alone through the Utah canyons, a suspended boulder dislodged while he was climbing down, smashing against him, crushing and pinning his right arm to the canyon wall. Assuming that he would die stuck, he spent 5 days trying to pry and pull, but no luck. The now dehydrated and delirious Ralston knew what he would have to do. On the 4th day, in order to free his arm, he would have to cut through and free himself from it. Ugh. He carved his name, date of birth, and presumed time of death into the sandstone canyon wall with his pocket knife, and with the same dull, broken multi-tool, took a deep breath, broke his arm, and then proceeded to cut through and amputate it, keeping himself alive.
Number 6, the hedgehog. This is one of the greatest stories of all time. This hedgehog just stepped in and saved a life. Sonic to the rescue, we love it. This story comes from an anonymous user online. It's so bizarre, so I highly doubt that it's made up. Let's do this, here we go. A hedgehog saved my life when I was in college. Great start to a story. I'm hooked. I used to work night shifts and cycle home around 4 a.m. There was a long hill to bike down, and then a bend in the road, and then a big hill to ride up. So I would usually bike around the bend full speed and rely on my hearing and the glare of the headlights to see if anyone was coming. One night, I was cycling home with headphones in because I had a bad shift. I wasn't really paying attention. I was going along at full speed when I saw a hedgehog in the road. How lovely is that? And then I braked just before the bend. Usually, I would have just dodged the hedgehog, as if he always appears, I love that. But the song I was listening to just made me feel like stopping and watching it for a second. Nice, it was probably some REO Speedwagon, I bet, something beautiful. Just as I pulled up, a UPS truck came around said bend at full speed with its headlights off. I wouldn't have even felt a thing. Now sadly, the hedgehog bit the bullet. The Grim Reaper did not come home empty-handed, that's for sure, but I'm glad you're okay. Thanks for sharing, that was wild.
Number 5. Wilson! Jose Salvador Alvarenga is a Salvadoran fisherman and author who was found in 2014 on and near the Marshall Islands after spending 14 months adrift in a fishing boat in the Pacific Ocean. He survived mainly on the diet of raw fish, turtles, small birds, sharks, and rainwater. And he didn't even use hooks or rods. Guy just barehanded everything that he ate. Apparently he would make a trap between his hands with food, and when a fish swam in between them, he would just clamp them shut. Yeah, this guy is a man. He was apparently out on an overnight deep-sea fishing trip when his boat was caught in a destructive 5-day storm, leaving him with only a handful of basic supplies and little food. Alvarenga's story was heavily reported worldwide despite initial criticism from skeptics, the whole vitamin C thing. He's the first person in recorded history to have survived in a small boat lost at sea for more than a year. He apparently swam clutching a raft to shore on small islands that is a part of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific before 2 locals found him naked, clutching a knife and barely speaking in Spanish. He was quickly hospitalized on the island before making a full recovery and eventually flying home to his family in El Salvador. This is the real Castaway, except no island, you know? Just seasick every day. Can you imagine? A whole year by yourself just clinging on to a little dinghy?
Number 4, turn it up. Okay, Kyle and I love blasting music. We'll let a song finish after we park before we leave the car every single time. You gotta let it play out, right? That's why this next story here caught my attention. It's 5 years old, it's since gained a lot of momentum online via the wonderful world of Reddit. Seen a lot of great stuff on that site, it's a good one. But it's an example of why you should always wear your seatbelts and B, always let the song finish. They say, I stayed in my car to listen to the end of the news on the radio after parking up. As I turned off the ignition, someone speeding lost control of their car and skidded straight into the back of mine, driving it 4 meters forward and through the cars in front. Tore the back of mine and rode off 2 other cars as well. I got a bit of whiplash and was rather dazed for a couple of days. The other driver was banned and charged with a string of driving offenses, of course. If I hadn't stopped to listen to the radio, I'd have been halfway out the car instead of restrained inside of it, and the other driver would have had manslaughter added to the charges. Yeah, news, podcast, Bruno Mars, whatever it is, let it finish, let it play out. Unless it's like the Joe Rogan Experience. Those are like 4.5 hours. You gotta maybe hit pause at some point, one point or another.
Number 2, Anthony Borges. Wow. Anthony Anthony not only survived the impossible, he also put himself at risk to save his entire class of 20, which he did. Anthony was a student at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Some of you may recognize this name for the Parkland shooting, which sadly took the lives of 17 people, with 17 others severely injured, and there would have been more if it weren't for Anthony. When shots rang out on February 14, 2018, Borges used his body to block the door of a classroom, resulting in 5 gunshots going through his body. Thanks to him, over a dozen students were saved, and remarkably, this is the crazy part, Anthony survived. He was shot in the back and his legs as he locked the door and used his body as a barricade. His friend Carlo Rodriguez said in a statement to ABC News, and I quote, "None of us knew what to do, so he took the initiative to save his other classmates," unquote. That is nothing short of heroic. Thank you, Anthony.
And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Tim Lancaster. On June 10th, 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 took off from the Birmingham airport. The plane rose to an altitude of 23,000 feet when all of a sudden, there was a loud bang. Luckily, it happened just as air steward Nigel Ogden entered the cockpit. Due to extreme decompression, 2 of the 6 windscreens shattered and Tim Lancaster was immediately sucked out of the plane. But Nigel, with his crazy fight-or-flight response, pun not intended, grabbed a hold of Lancaster's legs as the co-pilot made a descent and called for an emergency landing at Southampton Airport. Yeah, he was holding onto him through the windshield of the plane. Lancaster only suffered a fractured right arm, wrist, severe frostbite, and Ogden dislocated his shoulder, damaged his eye, and suffered frostbite on his face as well. But that's it. Luckily, these 2 survived this crazy event, but it was later discovered that the windscreens were only installed just 27 hours prior to when the plane took off. And the mechanics mistakenly used bolts that were much shorter in diameter than the standard bolts that they should have used. This one does not help my fear of flying one bit, and this one, it just leaves me speechless. I think I would have actually died from a heart attack or shock before anything else, like, not kidding. But Nigel, freaking bless your soul, and Tim, just wow. Yeah, I can't.